Afternoon. Today we're looking at Psalm chapter 29. It's a great psalm. It's emphasizing the sovereignty of God, His power, and His glory. And as we read the psalm today, it's just a short psalm. I want you to notice how oftentimes two words is used. One is the voice of the Lord, and then the second, His glory. And so when you see something repeated that often, you can see what the writer is emphasizing. So let's read Psalm chapter 29 today. And the psalmist begins by exhorting us to give unto the Lord, O ye mighty, give unto the Lord glory and strength. Give unto the Lord, verse 2, do his name, worship the Lord in the beauty of his holiness. Then in verse number 3, the voice of the Lord is upon the waters. The God of glory thundereth, the Lord of many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majesty. The voice of the Lord breaketh the cedars, and the Lord breaketh the cedars of Lebanon. He maketh them to skip like a calf, Lebanon and Syrian like the young unicorn or wild ox. The voice of the Lord again divideth the flames of the fire. The voice of the Lord shaketh the wilderness, and the Lord shaketh the wilderness of Kadesh, that desert region. And the voice of the Lord maketh the hinds and discovers the forest, and in the temple does every one speak of his glory. Interesting there. And then the Lord sitteth upon the flood, or above the flood. Yea, the Lord sitteth king forever. And then the final verse says this: the Lord will give strength unto his people. The Lord will bless his people with peace. Now, I want us to spend just a moment in verse number 1 and try to emphasize something. Notice there's something that we do to the Lord. We have something that we owe the Lord. There's an obligation on our part that ought to be fulfilled. And what he says is that we ought to give unto the Lord glory and strength. Now, there's some debate about to whom he's speaking of. When you see in the old King James, you mighty ones, and literally it referred to the sons of God. And most commentators believe that this has reference to the angelic beings or the heavenly beings that are in the court of heaven. If this is what he's emphasizing, we get a glimpse of the worship of God in heaven and giving him all the glory. And so that may be a possible interpretation because the sons of God are used in a whole lot of different ways in the Bible, and not only in reference to angels like Job 1 and verse 6, but also it refers to men at times. And he may be saying this. It may be, and if it is, it's something I think that is rather weighty, because if he's referring to the mighty ones as the princes and the rulers of this earth, he's telling those people in prominent and powerful positions that they ought to be giving him the glory. Wouldn't that be something if the leaders of the world and the leaders of our nation and the men who are centered in Washington would recognize that God is the creator of all things, and he has all the sovereignty and all the power. And we're going to see, as we just read, that his power and his glory is manifested in the creation. And that's why you see all these things that he's talking about, how strong his voice is and how powerful his voice is. If you look in verse number 2 for just a moment, he says, give unto the glory that God is due and unto his name. But notice the last phrase here: because God is the creator and he has sovereign over all the earth, over all the nations, that glory and honor is due him. And that's expressed, if you see that, in worship. Oh, if we'd understand that mankind was created to worship God, who is worthy of our worship. Now, notice I want to emphasize something about worship. There's so much confusion about it, but primarily, if we look at it fundamentally in the understanding of the word, this word that refers to bowing down, or in the New Testament, proskunuo, and the whole idea basically is simply this: when you come into the presence of God, He is your superior, and therefore you bow down and recognize His power and recognize His glory, and you humble yourself and you honor Him because you stand in the presence of someone far, far superior to you. You see, that's what would bring about humility on our part and reverence on our part. And what's interesting in verse 1 and 2, He's calling upon that of all the nations. I want you to notice He's not talking simply about people, who are part of a covenant people or a part of a church, but He's talking about that all men of the earth ought to recognize His glory and His sovereignty. Now, if He's referring to heaven, it doesn't change that fact. Now notice verse 4 and following, he talks about His voice, and the word voice is used, I believe, 7 times in this psalm, and so you can recognize very quickly that His voice is powerful. He talks about His voice as like the thunder and lightning and over the darkness and even over the earthquake, and His voice is so powerful, it's like the thunder, the lightning that cracks the cedars of Lebanon, and on, like a earthquake that crosses the desert and rips apart the earth. And so His voice is powerful, and you see the glory. And I mentioned the word glory is used in the psalm, and really it's used 4 times. And so there's in the worship, is going back to this thought for just a moment, but in the worship of God, not only do you recognize you're worshiping one who's far above us, who is supreme, who's transcendent, who's powerful, but we give Him all the glory. I'll tell you what, we need to understand that that's where our what we ought to glory in, and not boast about ourselves. Now, since He emphasizes the voice 8 times through this psalm, the question arises, doesn't it? Whose voice are we listening to? It's interesting that in Matthew chapter 17 has what sometimes we call the Mount of Transfiguration, where Jesus was actually transformed and they beheld His glory. And Peter, of course, speaks out and says, it's great to be here. And there's Moses and Elias there. And God intervenes. And in Matthew 17 and 5, if you remember, God, the God of heaven, said to those disciples, hear ye Him. And we're supposed to hear Him and listen to Him and obey Him. Then if you get over to Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 2, you recall, well, in verse 1, he talks about God in the past had spoken through the prophets and the fathers and so on. But in verse number 2, he talks about now God speaks through Him, that is Jesus Christ. Think about that. God is telling the world that we ought to hear the voice of Jesus and listen to Him and obey Him, and that He speaks through Him now. He doesn't speak through anybody else. God speaks through Jesus. So it's important when we think about it in this particular psalm, the God of majesty and glory and honor and power and sovereignty, that we ought to listen to His voice, which of whom He speaks through His Son now. And so it's important because there's so many voices out there today, and people listen to all kinds of different voices. And it's important fundamentally that who are we going to really listen to? And I want to encourage you in this very short psalm today that knowing who God is and knowing that His voice is the one we ought to listen to, I want to encourage you to do that. So it's a short psalm, it's a powerful psalm, and it's a psalm that we can personally reflect upon. But I hope that these psalms are helping you as we study this beautiful particular book. So now we'll be seeing you on next Monday. We'll continue in the Psalm chapter 30, and we'll be talking to you then.